Scripture for the message is 1 Peter 5, verses 1 through 7. So I exhort the elders among you, as a fellow elder and a witness of the sufferings of Christ, as well as partaker in the glory that's going to be revealed. Shepherd the flock of God that is among you, exercising oversight, not under compulsion, but willingly, as God would have you. Not for shameful gain, but eagerly. Not domineering over those in your charge, but being examples to the flock. And when the chief shepherd appears, you will receive the unfading crown of glory. Likewise, you who are younger, be subject to your elders. Clothe yourselves, all of you, with humility toward one another. For God opposes the proud, but gives grace to the humble. Humble yourselves, therefore, under the mighty hand of God, so that at the proper time he may exalt you, casting all your anxieties on him, because he cares for you. May God add his blessing to the reading of his word. The Apostle Peter tells us, put on humility toward one another, as if humility were something, clothing that we have, that we always wear with our behavior towards others. Now, we tend to think that the opposite of humility is pride. And because we don't tend to think of ourselves as very prideful, we don't think that humility is too hard to achieve. And yet pride is much more hidden than we think. It's not just us strutting around thinking we're better than everyone else in some kind of way. There's many tentacles to pride that kind of reach their way into the crevices of the soul. And one of those tentacles, for example, is judgmentalness. Anytime we or someone we love has been hurt and we say, I know what that person has done in hurting me or hurting someone else, there's a certain amount of judgmentalness, which means there's a certain amount of pride. We think we can analyze the situation and know it perfectly and know exactly why something has happened. When we do that and we judge in that way, that's an affront to God. That's not living by humility. When we think about how many times that we judge one another and maybe are still tempted to do so, we can see that true humility needs the power of Jesus. Jesus, in fact, goes to extraordinary lengths in order to take us and steer us from judgmentalness and steer us towards humility. That's what our text is lifting up for us, where Peter exhorts his fellow elders as one who's seen the sufferings of Jesus and who will share in the coming glory to be revealed. He seems to be addressing the question here, how can we lead? How can we help others? And he has three ways, he says here. Not in a forced way, but willingly, according to God. So not doing something because we have to, but doing something because we want to. Not for shameful gain, but eagerly. Not doing something so that we can get something out of it, but doing something for others' sake. And then the last one, not as lording over them, but becoming an example for them. So not just trying to domineer or dominate someone else, but simply leaving an example and letting that example do the talking in its own ways. Now, if they do this, these leaders, the younger ones, can be submissive, Peter says, and they can learn from their leaders. But then he kind of changes his tone and he addresses everyone, whether they're young, old, it doesn't matter. All of you, put on humility towards one another. As we said before, God's grace and power are needed to help us to be humble. So that's why he adds, therefore be humbled under the mighty hand of God, in order that he may exalt you in time. So it's as if Peter is saying, have you been hurt in the past? Are you being hurt now? Don't fall into judgmentalness and blame others. Instead, he says, cast all your cares upon God, because there's a care concerning you by him. God cares for you, and he will take care of it. We don't have to take matters into our own hands. If there is any judgment needed, God does the judgment. And in the meantime, if we're hurting in the midst of a situation, God takes care of us. And he cares for us, and he helps us through every trial that we ever face. So all we have to do is turn to Jesus instead of trying to solve or judge a situation or blame someone. Since this is so hard to practice, I think we see over time in our lives that Jesus will go to extraordinary lengths to move us out of this prideful judgmentalness and move us towards clothing ourselves in humility. Let's see how a woman named Leilani Appleyard experienced this. She didn't really particularly feel anything was going wrong in her life the day she started volunteer training at the local nursing home. In fact, at the doorway, she said, was a big man, had thick gray hair. He was in a wheelchair, and he rode up to the door, and he reached and opened it up for her. He said, "The name's Ray. I'm Lanny. I'm a new volunteer." "Well, you'll be Bubba to me. Down where I come from, that's a love name. We give to the little one in the family." "I like that," she said, and meant it. She thought his way was so warm and friendly and open, so unlike the gruff indifference my father had always shown me, she thought. Every Wednesday when she came for training, there was Ray waiting to open the door for her. In the training, she gets assigned to various patients that were there at the nursing home, and Ray wasn't one of them, so she decided to just visit him on her own time instead. He would always greet her eagerly, "Hi, Bubba." And little by little, they started to share with one another. One day, when she was trying to describe her husband to him, Ray said that he was married too. "Well, actually," he said, "we decided not to get a divorce." "Do you have any children?" "Oh, sure. Do they get to visit?" Oh yes, they come," he said. Lanny had never seen a visitor there, and thought, well, they probably live far away. They just can't get here very often. She started bringing Ray little gifts, like a soft towel and washcloth that he could use. And he would start doing things like teaching her how to play dominoes, and he would save his dessert for her so that when she would come to play, that she'd get to eat his dessert that he left. They became so close that one day when she was leaving and Ray was waving goodbye, a new housekeeper said, "Your father sure loves you." Lonnie started to say, "He's not," and then her throat caught. She found herself running out to her car and getting in. If you only knew my father, she thought. There was no games and no desserts, always too tired. Too busy. Most of the time I tried not to think of him because it hurt. But now, because of the housekeeper's comment, the memories came flooding back. Especially the one that the final straw was on her wedding day. The terrible thing he had done to me, she said. The band had begun a waltz, and the leader said, "Time for the bride and her father to dance." And Lonnie went out to the dance floor, and everyone was watching as he just stood there, and then finally said no, and walked out of the room, leaving her standing alone on the dance floor. The bitterness I'd accumulated while I was growing up took over my feelings. Resentment that he was never there for important school events in my life. The times he had threatened to walk away from the hard jobs that he had and walk away from Mom and me. Well, I could walk away from him, and I did. All that was 5 years ago. They hadn't spoken since. Occasionally there was a stray thought about patching things up, but she never acted upon it, and so nothing ever came about it. Anyway, I had Ray now, she thought. One day, though, Ray wasn't on the porch. So she went to the room. He's not in the room. She's getting worried. She goes to the nurse's station. Where's Ray at? He's in the hospital. His asthma got much worse. Are you family? I'm his friend, she said. She had almost said daughter. At the hospital, she went to his room, and he was all hooked up in intensive care with lots of tubes and IVs. And then he turned his head towards her. Bubba, I knew you'd find me. Ray, you weren't there. I was so scared. Come here, Bubba. It's okay. You're here now. And he tried to put his arms around her as best he could with all of the tubes hanging from them. After a very long visit, she finally said, I'll come back and see you tomorrow. Okay, Bubba. The next morning, though, she was eating breakfast, and Lonnie got a phone call. It was Sharon, who was the head of the volunteer training at the nursing home. Lonnie's hand tightened on the receiver, and she leaned against the wall, and a calendar that was hanging up there fell on the floor. We don't normally contact volunteers, but I knew you were so close, I didn't want you to see it in the paper. Ray died yesterday. That can't be. I was with him. I know, she said. He died just a few hours later. Well, after the call, Lonnie went out to the curb and picked up her paper, and there was the obituary for Ray O'Brien. Suddenly, she felt a surge of anger go through her. He was married, and he had children, 12 of them, and all but 2 of them lived in the area. She called Sharon back. Tell me why. Why weren't they there? She sighed, and she began to share with her, Ray used to be a drunk. He beat his wife and children. When he came to live here, they never wanted to see him again. I don't believe it, Lanny shouted. But then she remembered he was reluctant to ever talk about his family, and no one ever did visit him. It's true, the boss said, but other things are true too. He had counseling, and he faced his problems, his own abuse growing up, his drinking to escape his bad feelings about himself that didn't help at all. Over and over again, Ray asked God for forgiveness. He wanted to ask his family to forgive him too, but they would have nothing to do with him. I thought of him as a father, Lonnie said. And Ray thought of you as a daughter, I heard him say it. You gave him a chance to feel forgiven. I think God used you to comfort a sad, lonely man with nothing in his life but regrets. Lanny hung up the phone, and her thoughts started to go from Ray and his children to her and her relationship with her father. She's been down and picked up that calendar, and it had fallen open to a page that had a picture of a man with a little girl fishing together. Once long ago, my father had taken me fishing. It was a good memory, buried under the bad ones. A good memory buried by the power of judgmentalness. Lanny started to think about how hard her father's life had been. His mother had died when he was a small boy. He'd spent his childhood working next to his father in the fields. Never went to high school. He eventually had to support Lonnie and her mother with jobs that he hated. And eventually he was able to build his own business, often working all night long and then sleeping in the afternoon so she could go to college. And when she would ever ask, why do you have to work so much, he would just say, so you don't turn out like me. And then on the wedding day, for the first time in 5 years, she remembered an excuse that someone had made for him then. This was the first time that he had ever worn any kind of fancy clothing in his life, and he was very uncomfortable in a suit, and he didn't know how to dance. Slowly, I picked up the phone. Lonnie said, I needed to call my father. Jesus went to extraordinary lengths to break Lonnie free from the prison of judgmentalness and bring her into the freedom of humility. Every time we say, I know why someone has done this, and we start blaming them, we're hardening our hearts to God more than anything else. So let us take Peter's advice. All of you, put on humility toward one another. Yet pride tries to reach deep in our souls. We need Jesus' power to be clothed in humility, to root out the judgmentalness. So let us be humble under the mighty hand of God. And in his time, he will